I'm George Maschke with antipolygraph.org, and today I'm speaking with David C. Graham, who's the Libertarian Party candidate for Senate, for the United States Senate from the state of Kansas. And on his website, which is graham4 Senate.com, David mentions that he favors a smarter national defense, and uh, we've spoken about one of these aspects that he wants a smarter defense is with respect to polygraph policy. After all, the polygraph is the cornerstone of the United States' personnel security policy, and David has thoughts on that. And David, I was thinking perhaps you could begin by introducing yourself a little bit and telling us how you became interested in polygraph policy.
Sure, George. Well, first off, thank you for having me for this interview. Um, I became interested in the polygraph. There was a popular TV show on the PAX network, I believe it's now the ION network, called Polygraph. And I enjoyed watching that show because I myself had taken a polygraph and passed a polygraph in 1980 for a
Mhm.
part-time job at a convenience store. So I was looking for when I might be able to catch that show, and I ran across your site and started looking at the information on your site, and ended up, of course, reading the free ebook, The Lie Behind the Lie Detector, and that's how I became interested in polygraphy and its implications for our country.
Mhm. Right. And I mentioned to our viewers that we know each other. We've known each other for some years now because we both attended Doug Williams' trial in Oklahoma City back in 2015. And you actually attended not just the trial, but also his sentencing hearing. And you kindly reported on that. We published your report on antipolygraph.org. This is uh, 23 September 2015. Doug Williams sentenced to 2 years in prison for teaching polygraph countermeasures to undercover agents. And I think the Doug Williams case really uh, highlights the national security implications of relying on pseudoscience to protect the country, because the U.S. government was so concerned about Doug Williams teaching people how to pass or beat the polygraph that they sought to devise a way to silence him, which they successfully did. Well, with limited success that we can discuss, but they sent him to jail for 2 years. Um, so, um,
George,
yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Your audio went a little warbly there, so I just I'd alert you to that.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm hearing it fine here, so I think the recording will be okay.
Okay, all right.
So, so no worries. So, um, but yeah. So the Willems case, I think, has had big implications uh, for freedom of speech in the country. Uh, in that it seems like a case where the federal government targeted someone for prosecution with no evidence that he had committed any crime. They sought to construct a crime for which to prosecute him and to attempted to silence him. Um, and um, it's so. What are your thoughts about the Williams case and its implications for civil liberties?
Well, I think you've correctly identified that there are some problems there.
Mhm.
I just want to back up real quick to say, though, George, that I had, of course, been uh, on your site, not as a contributor, but had been on the site before the Williams trial,
Mhm.
and so when that came up in Oklahoma, me being here in Northeast Kansas, it wasn't out of the question that I could attend the trial, and so I took advantage of that opportunity.
Mhm.
Um, uh, my concern, like like you've expressed, is that the government set out to construct the crime to entrap Doug Williams.
Hmm.
Now, legally, it probably did not meet the definition of entrapment. Certainly, that's what Doug's attorneys believed, according to Doug, when I discussed that with him briefly.
Hmm.
Uh, Whether or not the judge would have allowed that defense or not, I don't know. Probably not. In any event, it certainly was entrapment in the ordinary meaning of that word, and as most citizens would understand the meaning of that word. And so, yes, I'm concerned about the free speech implications, but I'm also concerned about the implications of the government looking and creating crimes to entrap people on.
Hmm. Right. And then another interesting aspect of the Williams case was the government really seemed to be after Doug Williams' customer list, the people who had bought his book, How to Sting the Polygraph, and who had actually gone to get in-person training from him. They wanted the names of those people, and they got that information, uh, which is another, I think, civil liberties concern. Um, is it any business of the government what books people are reading? Um, so, um, well, moving on from the Doug Williams case, um, the the as I mentioned at the beginning, the cornerstone of America's personal security policy is polygraph screening. It's used by uh, historically first by the CIA, then the NSA, then later the U.S. Secret Service, and then almost all federal law enforcement agencies are now using polygraphs to screen not just applicants but employees, and some of them are regularly repolygraphing their employees. And this has, uh, on the one hand, resulted in many honest people being falsely branded as liars and being excluded from employment or wrongfully losing their jobs uh, after they've been hired. And on the other hand, numerous spies have passed the polygraph. So, to the extent that we're relying on polygraphs to determine whether someone is committing espionage or sabotage or terrorism or some other nefarious acts against the government, um, we're really, I think, shortchanging national security. And the National Academy of Sciences essentially confirmed this uh, in 2002 when they finished a comprehensive study on the polygraph titled "The Polygraph and Lie Detection." They determined that the accuracy of polygraph screening didn't justify reliance on it by federal agencies. So, um, if you were to become a senator, what would you think about expanding the protections of the Employee Polygraph Protection Act, which prevents private employers from polygraphing applicants and employees, to eliminate the uh, the loopholes that allow the U.S. government to do what it forbids the private sector from doing?
I think the government should be prohibited from using the polygraph in virtually all instances. Um, Certainly for internal purposes, for pre-employment screening, and for so-called maintenance or routine screening,
Mhm.
uh, for security clearances for our military, for promotions, and to either greater security clearances or within other organizations like the FBI, CIA. Uh, I'm against it. The only thing I can think that is a somewhat legitimate use would be if police still want to polygraph criminal suspects. Um, I don't really have an objection to that, um, but I certainly would extend the act to prohibit government from doing the things that they prohibit private enterprise from doing. Now,
Mhm.
whether or not private enterprise should be prohibited from doing uh, those acts, that's another discussion. As a libertarian, I tend to think People should be allowed to run their business however they like, even if it's stupidly so. But
Mhm.
certainly the government should not be relying on this pseudoscientific device.
Well, I think you're the only person running for political office I know of who has publicly taken that stand. And I hope that others will consider taking a similar stance. Um, One of the things I think we've discussed, at least uh, on occasion, is that whether we should be using pseudoscience for national security purposes isn't really a partisan issue, or it shouldn't be. Uh, it seems like a common sense policy that, regardless of one's political persuasion, one should be able to get behind.
I totally agree. I don't see any. Um, I just don't see any partisan or ideological slant to this issue.
Hmm. I think there is something that maybe prevents some people in politics from getting behind uh, polygraph policy reform, and that is the concern that it'll make them look weak on security somehow. That if you're against polygraphs, you're against security, when actually the opposite is true. Uh, in that, relying on junk science undermines our national security. Um, we've had numerous spies who have, uh, beaten the polygraph, and in part because of the polygraph seal of approval, have been able to uh, continue their espionage against the United States with less suspicion than they might reasonably have had otherwise. I'm thinking, for example, of Aldrich Ames, who was the CIA turncoat who spied for the Soviet Union and then Russia. He passed a polygraph twice while spying against the United States. Also, the Defense Intelligence Agency's senior analyst for Cuban affairs was a Cuban agent when she first applied to work with the DIA, and she passed at least one polygraph during her employment with the Defense Intelligence Agency, and that again shielded her for a time from suspicion. Uh, Shortly after 9/11, she was arrested for espionage. Incidentally, she's going to be released from prison in early January of next year. And it would be interesting if she were to talk about how she passed the polygraph. But I suspect the government doesn't want her to talk about that.
I
So
think
there
you're
may
right.
be restrictions on her speech. Uh,
Oh, absolutely.
yeah.
And I think that just as importantly, I mean, I guess both ends prove each other, but just as importantly, how many good people are we turning away?
It's in the thousands for sure.
And we'll never know what those people could have contributed
Hmm.
had they been in our service. So that really bothers me as well. I also think, though, George, you kind of hit on something about politicians not wanting to appear soft on national defense or security. Um, Politicians, I think, are not tackling this issue because it's sort of like, well, why do we need to rock that boat? There's no urgency.
Hmm.
No one's clamoring for it. But that belief, I mean, it's the secondary belief on the fact that the public believes in these things. Most people I encounter, uh, while admitting that the polygraph isn't 100%, do believe it is effective for most people most of the time on most questions.
Hmm.
And if 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 and when that starts to change, the politicians will run to be at the front of the parade in terms of eliminating it from our military and our alphabet agencies. But
Hmm.
right now, I think the thought is, well, I don't need to take that on because it's in place and most people think it does work.
Yeah, there's tremendous institutional inertia, and there is a common belief. I see it sometimes on social media that people wonder, well, would the CIA and FBI be using the polygraph if it didn't work? Uh, so because it has this official buy-in, I sometimes refer to it as the calligraphy as the official pseudoscience of the United States government. Um,
That's great. I love that.
and I think it really is. Um, and so there's another aspect of policy that's been in the news, especially in the last year with the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, which is that uh, especially during the Obama administration, many interpreters were, these are Afghans who were working as interpreters for the U.S. Armed Forces, were forced to take lie detector tests. And if they failed, they were summarily terminated, like the same day. Go away, don't come back. And uh, many of them had worked for years with the U.S. Armed Forces, been on combat missions, and based on the result of a pseudoscientific lie detector test alone, they were terminated. And worse, they were disqualified from receiving visas to come to the United States, which became very important for many with the collapse of the Afghan government and the complete withdrawal of U.S. forces last year. So now there are um, many, I think, at least in the hundreds, if not thousands, of Afghans who worked for the United States uh, in danger, who lost their jobs because of lie detector tests, and who are now prohibited from receiving visas to come to the United States. And what would you think about maybe changing this policy, maybe perhaps through legislation, to disallow the withholding of visas based on polygraph results?
Well, I would not make the granting or denial of a visa dependent on a polygraph, regardless.
Hmm.
Whether it would be a special type of visa, such as I think you're talking about,
Yeah, special immigration visas.
right, uh, or any other visa. I just don't think a polygraph should be administered. A lot of times people say to me, "Well, it's better than nothing," but it really isn't better than nothing.
Hmm.
Um, so I just, and it really does disturb me in the case of the Afghanis because a lot of them, first of all, got induced to work for the United States because we promised them. I say we, the United States promised them
Hmm.
that the United States would take care of them and their families.
Right.
And then to say, well, yeah, but that was based on cooperation. The polygraph says you're not cooperating, therefore we don't have to honor our commitment because you lied to us. It's wrong. These people would not have aided us, and they certainly I mean, could there be an exception to this rule? Probably so. But why would these people be going through all this if they weren't legitimately needing to get out of the country?
Hmm. Yeah, I've heard from numerous former interpreters who failed polygraphs and uh, were fired, denied visas. But the Taliban don't care that they failed a polygraph test. They uh, are in grave physical danger. Um, and so, yeah, this is a policy that I would very much like to see changed. Uh, and I hope you might be able to help accomplish that,
I
uh,
hope
that
so.
goal.
I would like to even see if there's some way we could still perhaps save some of those people. I mean,
Hmm.
my understanding is that the ones that are still alive are either in hiding
Yes.
in Afghanistan or either have or are trying to get out of the country. Uh,
Hmm.
but of course, the Taliban doesn't necessarily respect national boundaries either. So. Um, I would like to see what could be done to help those people.
Hmm. And finally, on the points I wanted to discuss with you, David, is the use of polygraphs for probation. And this is common in many states, like I'm not sure about Kansas, but I know in neighboring Oklahoma, There's the case of Benjamin Petty, who was on probation for 15 years, had his probation revoked based on, in large part, on failed polygraphs. Uh, in the state of Texas, probationers, especially for sexual offenses, are made to take polygraph tests. And the fact that someone has committed a sexual crime doesn't make the polygraph any more accurate or valid or reliable. And so the same concerns that apply to national security screening, I think, apply here to the screening of sex offenders. It's shortchanging security and I think a wrong-headed policy. But it happens at the federal level too, because there are federal probationers who are being required to take lie detector tests, and evidently the law allows that to happen. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about the use of polygraphs for this purpose?
Well, I'm totally opposed to, as I said before, any government use of polygraph with very limited criminal justice exceptions, primarily with criminal suspects as opposed to using it internally. Now, for probation or parole, though, it should not be allowed. Again, it's pseudoscientific. We're not getting any regular devices.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose if if it is going to be allowed for monitoring, then it should simply be a requirement that you take the polygraph, not that you pass the polygraph. Most probation parole, for example, there's a standard term that says if you have a police contact, you have to report that within 72 hours.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that alone can't get you revoked because you can have a police contact for a wide variety of reasons. But they want to know about it because then they will go and investigate. So I can see, although I would not agree with it, and I don't think it should be allowed, and I think it should be outlawed. If they want to say, okay, you have to take a polygraph, okay, require them to take a polygraph, and then if they flunk, supposedly, then you could go out and try and figure out why they flunked. But uh, but to say you're going to be revoked and it's a violation if you flunk the polygraph, it's madness. And in the case of Benjamin Petty, I think it was simply there was such a public backlash to his sentence. This was a very convenient way to do a two-step around that.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I think if that were to start happening more frequently, whether it was with sex offenders or any other type of offender, the plea bargaining system it would start to collapse. I mean, people have different views on plea bargaining, whether they like it or not, whether they think we should have it or not. But the reality is, it's essential to the criminal justice system. 95, 96, somewhere in there, percent of all criminal cases are resolved through some sort of a plea bargain.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a lot of times, it's like, well, the defense attorney, boy, he was slick, he got a plea bargain. But the people that really rely on plea bargains are the prosecutors because there's no way to prosecute all the criminals through a jury trial.
Mm-hmm.
So as I've been a prosecutor, and I'll tell you, it's very maddening to me when a judge doesn't go along with a plea bargain and exceeds that plea bargain, or says, "Well, I don't care that that the state doesn't oppose probation. I'm going to impose, I'm going to deny probation anyway," because then the next client, I say, "Hey, let's work out a deal. Here's what I can offer." They say, "Well, I don't care. That judge isn't going to go along with this." Or in the case of the polygraph, well, polygraphy is going to be part of the probation, and I can't risk my guy, failing a polygraph. So we're just going to take our chances at trial. The whole system could collapse. Now it would take some time, but it would be like an exponential curve, I believe. It'd be slow for that to start happening, but once it did start happening, our whole system would be in trouble. So if I'm elected as a U.S. senator, I do intend to introduce legislation which would prohibit any use of the polygraph for uh, screening or
Mm-hmm.
maintenance for probation or parole. And I would hope the states would do that as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, David. And uh, It's been a pleasure speaking with you today about polygraph policy. And I'd like to repeat your Senate campaign website, which is gramforsenate.com. And I encourage our viewers to visit your site and to learn more about your campaign.
Thank you, George. And just real quick, since some people may not know this or need to know this, Graham is like graham cracker, Graham, and then it's the number 4, and then Senate, senate.com. So gramforsenate.com. Thank you, George. This has been great.
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise.